The Principality of Lüneburg was a territorial division of the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg within the Holy Roman Empire, immediately subordinate to the emperor. It existed from 1269 until 1705, and its territory lay within the modern-day state of Lower Saxony in Germany. The principality was named after its first capital, Lüneburg, which was ruled jointly by all Brunswick-Lüneburg lines until 1637. From 1378, the seat of the principality was in Celle. It lost its independence in 1705 when it was annexed by the electorate of Brunswick-Lüneburg, but retained its vote in the Reichstag as Brunswick-Celle territory. When the Principality of Lüneburg emerged as a result of the division of Brunswick-Lüneburg in 1269, the domain of the Lüneburg princes consisted of a large number of territorial rights in the region of Lüneburg, but it could not be described as a unified state because many rights were owned by other vassals of the imperial crown. Not until the acquisition of numerous counties and rights in the 13th and 14th centuries did the rulers of Lüneburg succeed in building a unified state. Following the division of the principalities of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel and Lüneburg between Bernard and Henry in 1409, the territorial development of the state was largely complete. At the time, the Principality of Lüneburg included the larger part of the Lüneburg Heath and the Wendland and measured about 11,000 square kilometers. History. Emergence. The Principality of Lüneburg was created by the division of the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg, a state that had been formed in 1235 from the allodial lands of the Welfs in Saxony and given as an imperial fief to Otto the Child, a nephew of Henry the Lion. The name of the dukedom was drawn from the two largest towns in the territory, Lüneburg and Brunswick. Following the death of Otto, his two sons split the duchy in 1267 or 1269 into subordinate principalities, Brunswick going to Albert and Lüneburg to John. Together, the two principalities continued to form the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg, which remained undivided according to imperial law, something that is clear from the fact that inter alia all the princes of the various lines carried the title of Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg. In addition, the two capitals, Lüneburg and Brunswick, remained in the common ownership of the House of Welf until 1512 and 1671 respectively. Old House of Lüneburg. When John died in 1277, the regency was held by his brother Albert on behalf of John's underage son, Otto the Strict, before Otto assumed power himself in 1282. Otto asserted his rule through the prosecution of numerous feuds against the less nobility, which enabled him to consolidate his ducal authority within the state. He also continued the systematic acquisition policy in the Lüneburg Principality that had operated since the time of Otto the Child, rounding off the Lüneburg allodial estate through the purchase of numerous lands and rights, including those of Bleckede and Hitzacker, the county of Dannenberg and the county of Walp. Duke Otto was followed by his sons, Otto III of Lüneburg and William of Lüneburg. The instruction issued by the father in 1318 whereby the principality would be divided after his death between Otto III and his brother, William II, was ignored by the brothers, and in 1330 they assumed joint control of an undivided state. The focus of the rule in the early years was a further territorial consolidation of the principality. For example, they were able to considerably increase their estate in the region of Gifhorn through the purchase of the village of Vorlesleben, the county of Papentage and Wetmarschen. Another top priority was the political support for the towns, which were striving to develop themselves economically. For instance, the merchants of Lüneburg benefited considerably from work to make the river Ilmenau navigable between Lüneburg and Uelzen, and from trade agreements between the Lüneburg princes and the dukes of Saxe-Lauenburg. The two brothers reigned jointly until the death of Otto III in 1352, leaving William in sole charge until his own death in 1369. Lüneburg War of Succession. When William II of Lüneburg died in 1369 without a son, the first House of Lüneburg became extinct. According to Welf House rules and the desire of William, Duke Magnus II, Torquatus of Brunswick would have been the rightful heir. Emperor Charles IV, however, considered it an imperial fiefdom, and granted the principality to Albert of Saxe-Wittenberg and his uncle Wenceslas, thus precipitating the Lüneburg War of Succession. The town of Lüneburg supported the Wittenbergs and took the opportunity to escape from the immediate influence of the Duke, destroying the ducal castle on the Kalkberg on 1 February 1371 and forcing him to relocate his residence to Celle. An attempt on 21 October 1371, St. Ursula's Day, to overthrow Lüneburg militarily and to secure the old ducal rights, failed. In the military conflict that followed, neither the Brunswicks nor the Wittenbergs were able to enforce their claims, and only the Peace of Hanover in 1373 ended the war, at least for a time. According to the agreement reached there, the Welfs and the Wittenbergs were to rule alternately. Magnus Torquatus had already died in 1373, so the treaty between the two contending houses was further reinforced by the marriage of his two eldest sons, Frederick and Bernard, to the two daughters of Wenceslas, and by the marriage of Magnus's widow to Albert of Saxe-Wittenberg. The younger brother of Frederick and Bernard, Henry the Mild, refused, however, to accept the agreement and continued to prosecute the war. It was not until after the Battle of Winsen in 1388, when Wenceslas lost his life, that the Wittenbergs gave up the claims and the principality was finally secured by the Welfs. Lüneburg-Sate and Lüneburg-Sate War. The Lüneburg War of Succession resulted in a large plenitude of power going to the estates within the principality. To secure the support of towns and the lower nobility, both the Welfs and the Ascanians were forced to give the estates wide privileges, and enforce them with numerous rights and castles. The Seldukes, Bernard and Henry, had emerged victorious from the conflict, to be sure, but faced huge financial problems as a result. So when they appeared before the town of Lüneburg with a fresh request for funds in September 1392, they had to agree to a significant treaty, the so-called Lüneburg-Sate, in which the estates were granted numerous privileges and the dukes had to submit to the authority of a council of the landowners of the estates, in return for a loan of 50,000 marks. The years that followed were characterized by renewed tensions between the rulers and the landowners and attempts by the dukes to weaken the standing of the Lüneburg-Sate. In 1396 it was finally rejected, after he had secured the assistance Sweden and Mecklenburg by concluding a treaty of friendship and security. Duke Henry, soon to be followed by his brother Bernard, took the town of Uelzen as his residence, which forced the town to announce its withdrawal from the Sate and to pay homage to the Dukes of Lüneburg. In the course of the clashes that now arose between the dukes and the town of Lüneburg, numerous battles were fought across the entire country. Through the support of the Hanseatic towns of Hamburg and Lübeck, Lüneburg achieved military superiority, so that the Seljuks sued for peace with their opponents. In October 1397 there was a contractual agreement between the warring parties, but the restitution of the Lüneburg-Sate estate that had been sought by the town of Lüneburg was not forthcoming. Middle House of Lüneburg. The joint reign of brothers Bernard and Henry, from 1388 to 1409, was followed by another division of the Principality in which Bernard was given Brunswick and Henry received Lüneburg. After Duke Henry's death in 1416, he was followed by his two sons, William and Henry. The rule was characterized primarily by the financial constraints under which the country continued to suffer in the wake of the Lüneburg War of Succession. In 1428 there was a further division of the wealth estate between the two brothers and their uncle, Bernard, Prince of Brunswick. The brothers William and Henry received the land between the Deister and the Leine, which was later to become the Principality of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, having acquired the Principality of Calenberg, and their uncle, Bernard, received the Principality of Lüneburg, thus becoming the progenitor of the Middle House of Lüneburg. After Duke Bernard died in 1434, his eldest son, Otto, became the ruling prince. In 1446 he was followed by his brother, Frederick the Pious, who abdicated, however, in 1457 in favor of his sons, Bernard and Otto, in order to enter the Franciscan abbey at Celle. After both brothers had died in 1464 and 1471 respectively, Frederick the Pious left the abbey again in order to hold the reins of power for his 3-year-old nephew, Henry the Middle, the son of Otto of Lüneburg and Anna of Nassau. When Frederick died in 1478, Anna of Nassau ruled the principality for her son until he was old enough to take power in Celle in 1486. She then retired to her dower at Lützow Castle. Because of his role in the Hildesheim diocesan feud and the associated political opposition to Emperor Charles V, Henry was forced to abdicate in 1520 in favor of his sons Otto and Ernest the Confessor. Otto relinquished his princedom in 1527 and was compensated with the Amt of Harburg. In 1539, the youngest brother, Francis, who had also shared the reins of power since 1536, also abdicated and was given the Amt of Gifhorn, leaving Ernest the Confessor to rule alone. Ernest the Confessor and the Reformation. One focus of Ernest's reign was to restore the principality's massive debts. When he came to power, with the exception of the Schloss Votek, all the offices were pledged. Consequently, his efforts were aimed primarily at the redeeming them again. The necessary tax increases led to serious clashes with the estates. Duke Ernest succeeded, however, in asserting himself, and to instigate the enforced reduction of debt. A second focus of his work was the introduction of the Reformation. Ernest the Confessor was himself a student at Wittenberg and had been in contact with Luther's teachers there. Soon after taking over the principality, he began to reform the Church of the Principality to the Lutheranism. In 1527 there was a Landtag recess at which even those nobles who had been hostile declared their support for the new faith. In 1530 Ernest was one of the signatories of the Augsburg Confession and brought back with him the Augsburg reformer Urbanus Regius, who was largely responsible for the implementation of the Reformation in the Lüneburg state over the succeeding decades. When Duke Ernest died, his sons were still minors, and their two uncles, Otto and Francis, refused the regency. As a result, the emperor decreed that the Archbishop of Cologne and the Count of Schaumburg were to govern on the behalf. The eldest son, Francis Otto, assumed power in 1555, but abdicated as early as 1559 in favor of his brothers, Henry and William. Following Henry's resignation 10 years later, William officially reigned alone until his death in 1592, but due to his serious mental problems, he only played a very limited part in political life and spent his last years in mental derangement. His rule, like his father's, was dominated by an enforced policy of debt relief, but reconciliation with the town of Lüneburg in 1562 and the associated acquisition of part of the Principality's debt and imperial taxes by the town played a major role in easing the palace financial situation. Further important reforms included the Lutheran Church order, adopted in 1564, which practically completed the Reformation in Lüneburg, as well as the Aulic Court and administrative ordinances. William left 15 children including 7 sons: Ernest, Christian, Augustus, Frederick, Magnus, George and John. In 1592 the brothers agreed to entrust the government to Ernest, initially for 8 years, then for a further 10. Then in 1610 they gave him the Principality of Lüneburg and all its dependencies for him and his descendants as an indivisible whole. However, after his death in 1611, and given the difficulty of ever new divisions, in 1612 the brothers agreed another contract, whereby they would exercise power one after another, but only one of them would marry someone of appropriate social standing in order to continue the ducal lineage and thus maintain the unity of the Principality. They drew lots, the lot falling on William's second youngest son, George of Calenberg, who married Anne Eleanor of Hesse-Darmstadt in 1617. New House of Lüneburg. After the death of his uncle Frederick of Lüneburg, George's eldest son Christian Louis inherited Lüneburg in 1648 and became the founder of the new line of Lüneburg. He was succeeded by his brother John in 1665, who took over the government in a coup after the death of Christian. Despite the claims of his brother George, William, who was resident in Calenberg, who was older and thus should have been entitled to inherit, George William succeeded in prevailing and taking over the reins of power in Lüneburg, but had to cede Calenberg to his brother as well as the Principality of Grubenhagen, which had been added to the possessions House of Lüneburg in 1617. George William, often called the Heath Duke, led the princely court during its final flourish. During his reign the Baroque theatre was built that is still open today. The French garden was laid out and palace facade designed in its current Baroque form. After his death in 1705, George of Hanover, who married his daughter Sophie Dorothea, later known as the Princess of Alden, inherited the state of Lüneburg, which was merged into the electorate of Brunswick-Lüneburg and finally lost its independence. Welf side lines. In the 16th century several Welf secondary lines emerged which received their own territories. Harburg. Following his marriage to lady-in-waiting Mette von Kampen in 1527, Duke Otto relinquished his participation in the government of the Principality, and was compensated with the Amt of Harburg as his own territorial lordship. Harburg remained an integral part of the Principality. The ducal chancery in Celle continued to be responsible for border and territorial issues. The noble knights, the Amt of Harburg, continued to participate in the Lüneburg Estates Assembly and in Fof by the Duke in Celle. When Otto died in 1549, the Amt of Harburg should have reverted to the Dukes of Celle, but Otto's son, Otto II, succeeded in 1560 in having a new regulation added to the severance agreement of 1527. Harburg was defined as an hereditary possession and its territory increased by the district of Meusburg. When the Harburg line became extinct in 1642, the territory reverted to the lordship of the ducal house in Celle. Gifhorn. Personal disagreements between the brothers Ernest and Francis in 1539 led to the emergence of a domain at Gifhorn, the so-called Duchy of Gifhorn, in return for a renunciating his participation in the government of the Principality. Francis received Gifhorn Castle as compensation along with the Ämter of Fallersleben, Gifhorn and Eisenhagen. Even though Francis tried to force through his full sovereignty over his domain, important sovereign rights were retained by the ducal house in Celle. For example, Celle was still responsible for foreign policy issues, and the Gifhorn nobility remained part of the Lüneburg estates. When Duke Francis died childless in 1549, the territory of Gifhorn went back to Celle, Dannenberg. When Duke Henry went against a gentleman's agreement with his brother William and married Ursula of Saxe-Lauenburg in 1569, he had forsake sharing the government of the Principality and was compensated instead with the Amt of Dannenberg and the Klostertum of Scharnebeck. The barony of Dannenberg remained part of the Principality of Lüneburg, however, and important sovereign rights, such as foreign policy and tax policy, remained with the government in Celle. In 1592, after the death of Duke William, the territory was enlarged with the Ämter of Itzacker, Lachau and Warpke, but Henry's demands for a transfer of sovereignty were not met. After the Principality of Grubenhagen had returned to Celle in 1617, the Dannenberg line received the Amt of Wastra as compensation. In 1671 the barony of Dannenberg went back to the Welf line in Celle.